Good afternoon. I'm Daniela Souza-Gorov, and I lead the work in New York City for the New York Charter School Association. Welcome to our weekly Thursday webinar, where we do a deep dive into a specific topic. As in the past, we'll be recording this webinar and posting it and any related materials to the webinar section of our website. We heard from so many schools about
Mike, you're muted. Oh, no, you're good. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. We heard so many questions from our schools about philanthropy and fundraising in a post-COVID world. And today we have an expert to share her insights and answer your questions. Please help me welcome Catherine Haley, Vice President of Programs at the Philanthropy Roundtable. Prior to joining the Roundtable, Catherine spent 13 years working for members of the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate. She served for 7 years as the Chief Policy Advisor for Education, Workforce, Anti-Poverty, Global Health, and other social issues for former Speaker of the House, John Boehner. Motivated by the belief that all students deserve access to a great education, Catherine was instrumental in the successful reauthorization of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program. Unfortunately, Alex Johnson from Building Pack had a last-minute emergency and couldn't join us today, but we're in good hands with Catherine. Thank you so much for joining us. We have talked to many charter schools over the past few weeks that wanted to better understand the change in philanthropy in the current context. So given the budget cuts that we anticipated coming to public schools, many charters want to increase their fundraising efforts now. What are the main changes that you see happening in education philanthropy for the next school year?
First of all, thank you all so much. I'm grateful to be here on behalf of the Roundtable, and I'm grateful for this session. So thank you for your introduction, Daniela, and my gratitude to Anna and Michael and Becky for helping to organize this. First, all of you, I'm so grateful to all of you charter school leaders. You guys do incredible yeoman's work, and you are not only educators, but in some ways you're social workers and community providers. And I feel like in many ways, the way charter schools have served their students and families, you've also really served your communities. And so the anecdotes that I've heard from our members at the Philanthropy Roundtable and things that I've read in the media, just kudos to each of you for the incredible work that you've done during such a very difficult time, especially during the coronavirus. So I just want to extend my gratitude to each of you. Gosh, thinking ahead for the 2020-2021 school year, there is so much on school leaders' plates and sort of contemplating what that will look like. Obviously, in March, the Congress passed the CARES Act that provided emergency assistance through the ESSER funds and the GEAR funds. So state education dollars, all with emergency assistance to either get technology in the hands of schools, but also address things like deep cleaning and things. And I do hope that each of you have been able to benefit from that. Some of those dollars are just now being deployed. The Department of Education, it's rare that any amount of funding can be deployed in less than 60 days. And I think the fact that they were able to get regulations out in less than 45 and funds to states, state education chiefs and governors, I think was fairly impressive. And there was certainly language in there that to sort of direct to charter schools that these resources are available to you. So if you have that problem, please both work with your association, but also through the various other levers to make sure you have access to those dollars. The other challenge is not just like, oh my gosh, we're now doing distance learning, we need to access technology, we need to clean our schools, but just what does that look like for you all as you think about socially distanced students? How do you structure your day, and how do you continue to do distance learning if that's the direction and guidance that's been provided to you? So as I think about that for you all and then think about your philanthropic needs, I think a couple of things that I've heard from our donors. One, donors are committed to fulfilling their prior obligations. If anything, we've seen many donors either increase their emergency grants or fulfill their grant pledges to entities early. And I think that's really great. The hard thing is that for those donors that, or those individuals that are seeking new funding sources, the question is, what about me? And will you consider me as part of your portfolio? I think what we have heard from some donors that that's a bit of a pause right now as far as new entities. But what I would encourage each of you do, not only just in this moment, but also in the long term, is start building those relationships, not just with institutional funders like foundations, but individual givers who are also often are more flexible in their philanthropic giving. They can write a check fairly quickly. They might see something, feel inspired, and then write a check. And I feel like there's a couple different ways, and we'll answer some other questions that Daniela has, but just a few things that I have observed in visiting not just networks of schools, but individual school sites, is the importance of building relationships within communities. It's really important, not just serving your families, but sort of leveraging the broader network. Do you know bankers? Do you know church leaders? Do you know individuals that are in the community, business leaders, all of which you can invite in to showcase what it is that you are providing the community? When sort of those learning tours, and it might be a little bit difficult in this current state when we're not actually in school buildings, but you can share the culture of sort of what you have created using various other mechanisms. We have heard schools that have used social media like Facebook platforms, Facebook Live, that have invited individuals in to sort of to learn about their school. And the consequences, there's been increased community awareness, but we've also seen other donors like, I didn't know about this, like, how do I get involved? And so really beginning to show and tell and sort of invite people in to see that I'm fully aware that y'all are in the business of educating and sort of inspiring young minds, and sort of adding this storytelling element sometimes is really hard. But inviting people in, I think is really, really important, because it gives you an opportunity to tell your story, describe what you all are achieving, and then also invite in individuals the longer term opportunity to participate and partner with you.
Thank you. I had another call this week about fundraising. The advice that I got was the same. You need to bring one person per week to visit your school. But now I said it's going to have to be virtual visits, because probably we need to limit the people who come to our schools to keep our students safe, right? But so, given that with COVID now and all the economic situation, there are so many needs, right, in our society. So many needs, so many things now that funders probably are thinking about. Do you think that education will continue to be a priority for the funders who have been working with education in the past? And what do you think is the best way for us to position charter schools in this new context?
What a great question. I absolutely think education is going to continue to be part of that narrative. We had a private, sort of like a smaller group of donors just the other day, just discussing their emergency grant making. And over and over and over again, especially as we're in this moment of tumult, not just with the coronavirus, but with what we saw with George Floyd and sort of the increase of civic activism and sort of demand for change. Individuals see education as really an opportunity to really lift people out of poverty and to create greater equity. And I feel like the role of charter schools as sort of an innovative, nimble, responsive way of educating students and serving their individual needs in a way that's unique and special and sort of validates who they are as individuals. I think donors really, really, really support that and will continue to resonate with that. Just not very long ago, spoke with one of our donors in upstate New York. And they're actually doubling down on their philanthropic investment of the schools in their community. And when some of their schools haven't received their CSP dollars, their charter school program for New Starts, they're stepping in the gap and providing those bridge loans to make sure that those schools are able to open up on time. So yes, I absolutely think education is going to continue to be sort of front and center for donors. And I actually think that there are opportunities for new funders to engage in this particular work. But it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago, which is sort of inviting people in to sort of see what you're doing, and sort of the progress and the ways that lives and families have changed as a result of the learning environment that you as leaders have created.
That's great to hear that some of the funders who have been supporting charter schools plan to continue and are even doubling down, given that some other sources of revenue for us are going down, as you mentioned. And so we have a lot of schools in New York that have approached us and saying, I'm thinking about starting or ramping up my fundraising efforts now. So maybe they were very comfortable, with the per pupil aid, but now they're thinking, okay, I think I'm gonna need some extra counselors, maybe some extra resources for my online program, and I want to start to doing some fundraising. What is your advice for a school that is just about to start? Given this environment that you cannot really bring people to visit your school, people are afraid to interact in person.
Yeah, I do think it's again about relationships. So I think it's one. I recently had an opportunity to visit a single site school in Houston, Texas. They've been around for, I think they're one of the first charter schools that were started in the city. It's a single site. It's never really grown. Not a lot of people know about it, but their results are, they're just knocking it out of the park. It's very much of a community-based school, and they have realized they need additional dollars, in part because they're growing from a K-8 school, or actually it's a pre-K-8 school, into a high school, and they need to do a capital campaign, and they need to expand, et cetera. But nobody knew about that school. Literally, like many of the local foundations who have supported charter schools in that community had no idea it was in their backyard, in part because they were really busy doing the work of educating students and creating sort of lifelines of opportunity. So I guess the first thing is figure out within your network who's already connected to the school. Certainly by, like a $5,000, $10,000 check, each of those things sort of amount to more as you sort of group it together, but it really starts about relationships. So who within the community can you invite in for a conversation? It's difficult to go in for the initial ask if you don't have a relationship with someone. So first figure out who within the community that you already know that you feel like might have either connections to other potential funders, either foundations, and then sort of invite them into a conversation. I think, and be able to effectively tell your story. And then like obviously, if you don't know somebody, asking them to invest in your school by the end of the summer might be a little bit difficult, but you can begin that relationship over the next few months to be able to then invite them in for a future visit that then leads to hopefully something more substantial. That I think has been some of the more effective ways. I live here in Washington, D.C., and one of the local area foundations has partnered with one of the charter school associations, and they've constructed learning tours where they bring in leaders of the community in all different sectors. And the benefit of that has not only been philanthropic giving, but it's also inspired individuals within the building community. So if they're going to start residential construction or even commercial construction, is there a way to incorporate a future school into that place, given that real estate is so difficult for charter schools to come? Anyway, so it's a sort of like enlightened individuals throughout the community of like, oh, I might not be able to give either corporately or individually, but I am incentivized from a real estate perspective to create space for you. So again, that might be another way. And if you are a single site school and maybe there's other single site schools, maybe see yourselves as collective assets. And is there a way you can create sort of group learning tours where you kind of go and visit all the different schools, and then it kind of individuals like to be part of things. So if one person goes and you like invite your friend, and then you can bring other community leaders into that space.
That's really, it really resonates with another conversation that I had with a school leader who said that also sometimes it's not just the checks, but it's the services or the kind of favors that, you know, potential donors can give it. And this school leader was mentioning that there was somebody on their donor list who then offered, oh, you need to hire this consultant and I'm going to help you hire because this is what I do as a job. And so he said, it saved me so much time and it made sure that I hired a consultant. And that's not like a monetary contribution, but he said, if I would actually quantify, you know, the hours of my time that was saved, it is probably, you know, in a couple of thousands of dollars. So it's good to think in this way as well in your relationships. You know, you have talked a lot about relationships and connections and, you know, really developing those contacts and those close relationships with funders. And we have heard from many charter leaders of color about the barriers that they face to address, to really access funders and to really have those close relationships. And we know that, you know, we have school leaders of color sometimes receive less funding, right? And so how do you think funders are perceiving this issue now, given all the conversations that are happening in our society about race? And what recommendations would you have for child leaders of color to really be more successful in fundraising?
A great question. I've spoken on panels on this specific topic before. I think several things. One, I do think that there's a greater sensitivity instead of just going to the well, so to speak, going to the thing that's known. Donors are really thinking about like, well, how else can I expand the resources that I'm investing in my community to reach more individuals? So I do think that there's a receptivity of that. And we've heard that from different individuals throughout the country that are taking steps toward that. Again, it comes with relationships. So for those foundations, they might be a non-solicitation foundation. You might find that you have a donor, whether they're in Albany or Buffalo or Rochester or New York City, that says, you know, we have a non-solicitation agreement or non-solicitation policy, which means you can't just apply for dollars. Perhaps you, through their information process, send a note saying like, I'd really like for you to come visit my school. I'm not sure that you know about my school. I know you care a lot about charter schools, and this is how we're serving the community. I'd like to invite you for a visit. Again, it's just sort of that invitation in. The other thing is that, so I think that that's really important, sort of taking that initial step. It's not like, hey, fund me, this is what I need. Just on that same note, there are many donors that have specifically foundations. They have a grant-making process that's often on a timeline. So they might take in applications at a certain time, or they might invite applications at a certain time, and then they process it maybe 1 or 2 or maybe even 4 times a year. And so again, you have to sort of be invited into that process. But I would encourage each of you to sort of invite someone in to come and see. The other is try to figure out who within your own network might have other relationships. Like, you know, maybe there's a parent, or maybe there's one of your faculty members that has like a certain type of relationship with individuals. Could you ask that in person for an introduction, just to be able to begin that discussion and conversation? And then the last is also just looking at the assets of the community. I think a number of you are familiar with Jamila Prince with Faith Acts and how she's been able to leverage the faith community. There are many leaders within a community that have other relationships. So are there individuals within that community that can introduce you to other individuals, you know, sort of creating that ripple effect? I think those are some of the ways that I would certainly begin. And that's often what I have seen in the different communities where we have donors that are operating and supporting charter schools.
It's good to hear that donors are thinking about that and hopefully are going to create more avenues for them to have more closer relationships with child leaders of color. So we get that more even distribution of funds. And one other group that we've heard many questions as well is from independent schools. So independent schools have very different capacity, right, to do fundraising, and sometimes they don't even have somebody who is like, whose job is just to do development. So it's the executive director or the principal, the founder, who is doing all the fundraising efforts. And as you mentioned before, it's not only, it takes a lot of work to raise funds, but also it takes a long time, right? There's also the question of the cycle. And so what advice do you have for independent schools if they are gonna really start to pursue fundraising this year? And I would mention that I've heard some frustration about hiring consultants who don't deliver concrete results. This is something that we are working on. Okay, who are the consultants in New York that we can really, that some other schools have already said they have done a good job, because I've heard from many schools that were not very happy with the results of their consultants.
That's yeah, the issue of consultants is a really a great and big one. I think even philanthropic entities that are deploying resources that have consultants, I think, say also sometimes have a frustration about that, of whether or not someone's actually doing the good hard work. I think again it requires time. I feel a little bit redundant, and perhaps some of you on the call are probably shaking your head in frustration, and maybe you're thinking, oh, that's what we're already doing. But again, I really do think it's about inviting people in, and it's about sort of showcasing what you are all about. Whether it's inviting community members to attend a graduation, or inviting community members to attend your debate, or a debate amongst students, or a performance by students, or a graduation. I think it's really important that individuals are brought in. Like, charter schools aren't often seen as neighborhood or community schools, but in many ways they are, and they create maybe their own unique community. And I think it's important for individuals to recognize exactly sort of the assets that you all are bringing to the community. And so I think inviting people in, if you don't have the time or space to show people around your school, try to figure out ways to connect them and bring them in, or create even like building relationships with, let's say you have lawyers or doctors or bankers or other business leaders in your community. Is it possible to invite those individuals into your school for a show and tell, or as a source of inspiration? Like, you students have this capacity not only to be like this person, but to exceed and excel well beyond this individual, and you can come back and be a part of this community. So I wonder if there's ways to invite people in, again, so you can build that relationship, so that then it leads eventually to the ask. For individual donors more in particular, and for single sites, we've often seen it's more about the individual connection rather than a foundation. It's sort of that, I have a personal connection to you. I understand your mission. I believe in your mission. I see what you do, and I want to support you. So again, I think it's that element of bringing people in, and often individuals, and then once you have established a relationship, it's making the ask. So again, it's so much on the leader, or maybe you can have like an assistant, or maybe there's like a super zealous parent or aunt or grandmother that can serve as sort of the unofficial official spokesperson and champion for your school. Sometimes even that, I think, inviting parents into that process to be the co-storyteller, it not only empowers them and sort of validates them and the decisions that they have made on behalf of their children, but it also invites them into the process to make that about their own community.
I agree. And I have also seen how effective it is to have teachers telling the story of the school and sharing the work. That can be very, very effective as well to attract more people to your school for sure. One follow-up question on this area of telling your story of your school. In so many of these debates, charter schools have really relied on test scores. And because of the pandemic this year, we are not going to have this year. We don't know if we're going to have next year. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So what is your advice, given that many schools that are new are probably not going to have test scores for at least 2 years, right? So how would you advise on telling their story if they cannot rely just on test scores?
I think, I've been really impressed by charter schools that have been able to talk about the percentage of students that are engaged in distance learning. I live in a county where they more or less haven't done any distance learning. And so, I've been actually incredibly, for those nimble and even single site, in some cases, multi-site schools, the way that they have been able to serve students, including those students that don't have internet capabilities, they might not have devices at home, but they've flipped very, very quickly to either creating packets. Teachers have been on the phone. There have been conference calls. Some have shown up at doors, all with the goal of engaging student learning. I think being able to tell your story of how students have engaged, whether it's X number of books read or this type of content has been covered. If you as a school are using online technology, I think you should be able to track student progress. You might not have the state benchmark assessment, but you should be able to assess whether or not are students learning on track? Are they gaining expertise in certain subject matter? And being able to communicate that, I think, is really, really important. And also, I think doing satisfaction surveys, not only of students obviously tend to report, have a less positive view of the world than maybe their parents. They might be like, oh, learning is terrible. But being able to capture that information of what this experience has been like for them and being able to then share that out, assuming it's modestly positive, but also parents. This has been a really unique time for parents to see how students learn and being able to, oftentimes it's more about the parents' view of their child's education. And if parent satisfaction is really high, students often continue to stay in specific learning environments unless certain things happen. But do parent satisfaction surveys to figure out, you as a mom or a dad or aunt, uncle, or grandmother or grandfather, how have you seen your child grow? Please relay information back to me. And then being able to share that out. We don't have these test scores, but these are some of the social emotional learning and growing that has occurred, or our kids were able to grow in this particular content area based on the online curriculum that we were able to use. So I feel like there's different ways. You might not have those hard numbers, but there are other sort of tangible ways that information can be communicated.
It's interesting what you said about parents, because I have a first grader and I thought I knew a lot about what he was learning at school. And now that I actually see here what he's doing, I had no idea. So I do agree with you that I think parents now have a lot more insight about what actually their kids are learning. And so their voice is going to have even more expertise now.
There was a recent poll that was done a couple of weeks ago. The sample size wasn't huge, but large enough where the individuals could get statistically significant information. It was something around 40% of parents said that they would contemplate homeschooling their kids next year. And parents of school age kids, and it's oh my gosh, well, even if 1 to 5 to 10% of parents make that decision, I think it would be really, really remarkable, incredible, totally disruptive. But I think it goes to this idea of many parents thought that their kids were learning certain things during the academic day. And what they found was that wasn't necessarily the case. And this, the data that was collected was not based on like ideological views. It was Republicans, independents, Democrats. It was individuals from the north, south, east, west. It wasn't sort of siloed in a specific area. It was people that were like, wow, I had no idea. And I actually think I might be able to do this better given the online resources available to my child than what the school system provided. And I think that's, again, like a huge opportunity for charter schools. You all are really, really nimble. Your staff is really nimble. You're not the sort of like the messaging around like us versus them, charters versus district schools is really about bureaucracy. Like you all are able to nimbly respond. You can figure out why one student's learning or why one class is growing really quickly. Well, perhaps you can get that information from another teacher and share that. And this has been an interesting opportunity for parents to be like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Or like, oh my gosh, I had no idea to the depth of knowledge and growth that my child is engaging in. So anyway, I commend you all to really sort of use this opportunity to tell your story. And given the social media platforms, there's lots of different ways for you to share that out.
Great. So last question, and then I'm gonna open for questions from our participants. So please start typing in the chat your questions. So you have had a lot of experience in education and philanthropy, and I'm curious, what is the biggest mistake that you have seen charter schools doing when they engage with funders?
Oh, that's a good question. I think so. I think this sometimes this sort of falls also in just the nature of charter schools. Charter schools are they're governed by a charter. They have certain things that they intend to benchmarks that they intend to achieve over the next period of time. They have a certain mission that they're trying to achieve, and sort of the harsh reality of charters, if you don't meet those benchmarks, you don't get to continue. And that sometimes
even when you meet, they try to.
And then, yeah, well, Buffalo, my gosh, Buffalo Science Academy just said that, and I'm grateful that whomever made the wrong decision sort of changed their position and realized that, oh yes, not only are we going to authorize you to open a new school, but we're going to terminate the original school's charter. Yeah. That made no sense to me at all. But I think there are some schools that sort of like, well, you've given me a grant once, like you'll always give me a grant. Sort of many donors that I have the honor of working with, they see their philanthropy often, sometimes it's sustaining, like let's help you grow and sort of move, but many of them sort of are a one-time grant maker, and those dollars are not going to be there forever. And so they'll work with you often to help find other funding sources, or they'll say, I'm going to provide you this capital so that you can do this thing that will allow you to be more sustainable into the future, or figure out other revenue models. So I think this one idea, this thought that like you'll always be there for me, that's not always the case. I think that's probably one of the sort of the challenges. And then the other thing is, and some people have certainly criticized philanthropy for this, but philanthropy is often driven by the original, whether you're an individual wealth creator, you've earned wealth and now you're giving away, or you've earned a lot of wealth and you've created a foundation. Many donors are mission driven. And if you don't fit within their mission, then getting a grant is going to be very, very difficult. They've put guardrails and parameters because they really feel passionate about specific things. So if you are in sort of a performing arts themed charter school and you're going to a donor who's totally passionate about STEM and sort of cultivating a learning environment to create the next scientist, breakthrough scientist, if you're in sort of a performing arts charter leader and you're trying to convince that specific funder that you're going to fund them or that they should fund you, it's somewhat of a mission misalignment. So trying to understand what motivates a particular individual and sort of like play into those strengths, I think is really, really an asset. But if you just sort of see someone, a person of means, and say, well, you're just going to fund me, you really need to find that direct hook.
Okay, so I heard that if you have a donation, don't assume that's going to come every year, right? A lot of one-time funders, and make sure that you meet their funding criteria, right? So don't try to squeeze your program or your school idea.
Exactly.
There, like
you said that far more succinctly than I did. So.
Great. So, okay, so we're going to open for questions now. If anybody has any questions, please type here in the chat. And I know you have also been talking to a lot of charter leaders. I'm sure you have some questions.
A shout out to Ariel in Buffalo, who is preparing to open a school, for taking the initiative to text me to tell me that the chat was not working. So we will field Ariel's question first, but we're now confident that the chat is working, so fire away. So Ariel's question, which I think is spot on, because Catherine and I couldn't agree more in my own personal experience about show, don't tell, and build relationships. What advice would you have for folks like Ariel who don't have a school yet for startups?
Yeah. One, I don't know where you are based. There's some donors within a particular community who have sort of carved themselves out as sort of a startup funder. If you're in Buffalo, the Cullen Foundation has been incredible in that particular way. I don't think they necessarily fund everyone. They have their program officer is like really meticulous and will ask you really, really hard questions and how you intend to serve students and improve student learning. But sometimes there are local foundations that has become sort of their bread and butter. They're risk takers. They see their philanthropy as risk capital and they want to help support you. If you're a part of sort of a Building Excellent Schools type fellowship, there are some donors that often sort of support BES fellows or Building Excellent School fellows in their initial startup phase. So that might be, I just saw, I think someone just sent a note. Sorry, I hope I didn't embarrass anyone. There are some within the community. Again, I think what I have seen in different communities, if you're going into community and you're going to create, sorry, there's like a bunch of pop-ups, so I'll try not to look at any of the questions.
Yeah, you don't be distracted. I'll tee them up for you. Just share your wisdom.
For some of those folks, I think what I've often been really impressed by is one, know your community. You've chosen your specific region for a reason. You obviously have a tie there. You might have you might have had an experience, or you've sort of done a landscape and you've decided that's the place, given your model, you really want to really serve kids in that particular way. Part of the due diligence is really understanding the assets of the community, the building relationships within. So as you're figuring out not only my school model, but also where you're going to find space, you need to understand what are the assets, who are the people in the community, and you should build relationships with that. Because if there are entrepreneurs within that community, I feel like you should be able to communicate your idea to them and how the school that you are building and the culture that you'll be building will help essentially fill the pipeline of future Mr. Smiths. And so really sort of building those relationships and appealing to different individuals within the community. So
that's great. So, go ahead, Daniela.
Go ahead. I was going to start asking here from the chat. So one question from Harvey Zuckerman: what do you think about asking those with whom you have relationships with to fundraise for you? And one more question was, is it better to invite possible donors individually or at a major event designed just for possible donors?
I think there's benefits for all of that. individuals that are really excited about causes often are really excited to tell other people about why they're really excited about their cause and why they should join them in that particular movement. And so when you think about all of you as charter leaders, you have a board. When you think about your board as an asset, it's not only from a governance perspective and making sure you have high quality curriculum and that you are sort of, working toward the outline of your charter agreement, but they should also be assets in building relationships with the community and sort of building and sort of being in, not all boards are fundraising boards, but there often is a fundraising element. And so even if it's like $5,000 or $1,000 or $500, each of those dollars help build upon others. And so I think it's actually really important to leverage those that are already giving and saying like, hey, we're going to do this capital campaign, or there are other individuals within your network story, or individuals on the board. Like, are there individuals that we should be inviting in that can be strategic supporters? People often like to be included, but they don't know to be included unless they're asked. So getting at your point about, do you ask individuals to come and see, or do you do a broader corporate gathering of individual donors? I think there's opportunities for both. For a certain type of major gift giver, they might want to see things on their own and sort of do things more subtly or privately. But there might also be, I don't know if Florine is on this call, but I had the opportunity, the Collin Foundation is a member of the Roundtable, and I had the honor of spending a few days with them in Buffalo and visiting some of their schools. And one of the campuses that we visited had a community evening event, and they invited community leaders from all across the city to hear from their students, hear from some parents, and also hear from the faculty. And it was early September, it was early in the school year. You had a couple of scholars that had been engaged for a while, like they had been part of the school culture, but then you had some newbies. And there wasn't a dry eye in the entire room because kids were so, like the adults were so moved by the testimony of these young kids. And then from the parents and just sort of the growth that the parents experienced from their children being in this learning environment. I have no idea if that like turned into check writing, but you had bankers and you had other leaders and arts and culture type people, and they were really moved and it pulled at the heartstrings. And so you have an event, you build a relationship, they've seen, they've experienced, and then you can sort of invite them into that process to figure out like how they can help support the growth and the learning of the students at that particular school.
Great. I would add also that I think in my experience, sometimes you said it's very important to ask, and sometimes you just never know. People that you think are going to be great supporters of your cause do not support, but then people that you think are not going to be so supportive, like do so much more and beyond that you expected. And so I think it's always really important to give a chance, because a lot of people will surprise you positively.
And just on that point, like years ago, I was a participant in a program, and part of being in the program was fundraise, and I was stunned by the people that chose to give versus those that I thought would give and didn't. And then I was stunned by the level of gift. I mean, I was just out of college, and so people were giving like maybe $100, or maybe someone gave like $500. Like, those people don't even have 2 pennies to give, and I can't believe they supported this thing that I'm about to do. And then there are people that I expected and they didn't give at all. And so my encouragement for all of you, and I work for a nonprofit, and we get people tell us no all the time. And then sometimes people say yes, and we're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said yes. And then there's some people that are like, you know what? You should have asked for more and we would have given you more, but you didn't. And it was like, we had no idea. Okay.
Next time.
If there's a next time, right? So.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so here one more question.
By the way, Florine just I went to see Buffalo Collegiate. That was the one sort of had the moving, crying experience for everyone.
Yes, shout out to Buffalo Collegiate.
Daniela, before we move off board engagement, I'll just say my personal reflections are that I waited too long to, I'm going to use the word force, but even on boards that don't see themselves as fundraising boards, to set the expectation, number one, that they are either giving a personally meaningful amount every year, or they are doing something to engage other people in the school, even if it doesn't result in giving. So hosting a dinner party, bringing a friend to see the thing that they're passionate about. I waited too long to do that. And then when it was time to start, when there was a campaign or something like that, some people were very uncomfortable. Some people felt like they had been, an expectation had been set that it wasn't a fundraising board. And so I think one of the things that I would just say to people is like, start now. Because the other thing that I didn't know as a school leader was that when you are really pursuing significant gifts, one of the first questions that folks will ask is, what is your board participation? And if the answer is 0, it's not a good look.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, so starting now, and I think there, there are so many opportunities presented by the current context, as challenging as it is, to interrupt whatever your normal was that isn't what you want to be your normal, and to say, not everyone has to write a check, but if you're not writing a check, who have you shared this passion with, and how can we brainstorm about, bringing someone in your network in to be aware of the great thing that you're a part of.
That's great.
One more question here. So how do you build a culture of giving and advocacy among a board of trustees that is not accustomed to giving or to championing the school? So I think Anna just spoke a little bit about this, but what have you seen, Catherine, in your experience, the most effective ways for schools to structure board member expectations?
Well, one, I think if you're not doing it, you should begin to figure out how to do that. And that might be just an honest conversation as you as a school leader communicating to the board, like, look, we are modeling along and we are doing great, but we need to grow. And the only way we can do that is if we grow our assets. And so, which means that we're going to have to start raising money. And I've seen selfless sacrifice by many school leaders that sort of give of their own time, and not just their time as leading the school, but also give their treasure. And so be like, I'm committed to putting in X myself, and I'm inviting you into that process. And I'm inviting you all into this conversation of like, how can we leverage our collective assets, whether it's you're a really good communicator and a really good community relationship builder, or you're able to write a check or bring your friends in, is that we need to figure out how we can work together on that. Because in the future, one of our goals will be that all members of the board are contributing in some particular way.
Great, thank you.
I'm not very good at that.
Well, and I'd only add to Robert's advocacy part of the question that we are more than willing to present to your board. Yes. And sometimes hearing from an outside voice about what's going on in the landscape and why that is a call to action for them as board members and with a different set of capacities than the ED or the principal or something like that. And so if it's ever helpful for us to paint that picture, we're happy to do it.
One thing I just, on the advocacy part, we have donors all over the country. And one of the things that I've been really impressed by for those donors that give to a wide swath of charter schools within their particular community. They do seed grants, they do, they'll do growth, they do active recruitment from other communities. One of the things that they have made, this is like a sort of donor advocates, is that they have seen their role as really being advocates and sort of intercede on behalf of the charter school leader. So if they have relationships with the building and permit office, or they have relationships on the city council, you know, if you're going into a community that has really deep, long relationships, like where it's multiple generations of people, building relationships with those individuals can be really, really, really helpful, because those can be the person, well, oh, well, my, you know, second cousin 3 times removed is on the city council, or, you know, my wife's sister's aunt's friend, whatever, is like in the building and permit office, or, you know, those relationships matter. And traditional public schools leverage those relationships all the time. Other sectors leverage relationships all the time. And that, I think, from an advocacy perspective, advocacy doesn't necessarily have to be political, like go and pass this piece of legislation, but advocate is like, I care about you, I'm advocating for you, I'm going to speak on your behalf, I'm going to intercede on your behalf. And leveraging your board can be really, really, really helpful in that particular way. I will say that when I was on the Hill, and family members would be like, oh my gosh, you work with lobbyists all the time. And I was like, a lobbyist is not necessarily a dirty word. A lobbyist is an advocate for literally every single cause you could think about, whether it's for cancer, whether it's for education, whether it's for green space, like whatever it is, like a lobbyist is an advocate, and I would use your board as your advocate, the person that is going to intercede and stand in the gap on your behalf and is going to liaise to the community as to like what you're doing, assuming all of you on this call are really, really doing really great things for kids, that these are people who are willing to stand in the gap and say, like, I'm for this school, I'm for this particular community, I'm for these kids, and sort of create that space.
Great. Okay, one last question from the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition. Who should be the primary relationship holder with donors, I believe, the board or the AD? So how do you see the division of responsibilities here between the board and the AD?
That's really great. Sometimes I feel like the executive director or the principal or head of school is the best person if they're really charismatic, or possibly they're the one that launched the relationship. For board members, I think often there are some board members that sort of like keep those relationships close and they sort of serve as the broker. I think that's fine. But, you know, if you're going to have that lasting relationship, I think at some point there needs to be a bit of a transition so that there is that continued relationship. I know for our organization, our board is a really active board and they build relationships with all kinds of people, but then they pass that relationship on, whether it's to our president CEO or our president emeritus, or even in many cases, there are program staff that really own those relationships. So again, it's sort of identifying the right person based on that personality and how that individual responds.
I agree, and I would,
but
no, it is helpful, yes. And I would add that if your board is going to do some of this work, make sure they are prepared to talk about your school. Of course, they cannot talk with the depth of your ED or the principal, but they need to be able to tell the story with some level of detail. Well, great. Catherine, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your advice. This is something that we have received, as I said, like many, many questions from our schools, and we're always trying to support them in things that they are worried and bringing experts. And so we really appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you all so much
you.
for the opportunity. Daniela, Anna, Becky, Michael, and then Janika, I didn't see you. Sorry. Thanks to all of you and for the great work that you're doing. Really, really grateful.
Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Bye.